All right. And welcome to the Philosophy Chat, guys. We're going to begin in 2 minutes. It's been a while. It's been a little bit of a minute since I've last made a stream. Combination of being a little bit burnt out, running out of topics to talk to, and also just asking people to talk with on a continuous basis can be quite difficult. But there has been enough time, at least, to do a good old criticism of certain types of YouTube videos that are popular. And this day, I'm going to be doing sort of an overview of one of Destiny's videos, Morality. I have actually not seen the video. I don't know if it's bad or good or neutral or... Ooh, that was a little loud. I don't know if it's good, bad, or neutral. But we'll find out, won't we? One of the things that I probably won't be able to critique too much is, sorry, my throat just woke up. I need some water. One of the things I might not be able to critique is the political avenue of this video. I also know Perspective Philosophy ended up doing some his own little critique of this video. So we will begin. We will begin. Welcome aboard once again. Let's go to the camera. To the camera. Let's see if I make this bigger. How much of that screen will it take up? Okay, quite a bit. Quite a bit. Let's make that smaller. So, there's the first few timers here. Feel free to, at any point, ask questions if you have any sort of questions for me about philosophy. They don't necessarily have to be about philosophy. They could be about my personal life as well, although I won't get into too much information. I don't really care what the questions are about. It could be about favorite movies for all I care. But feel free to ask some questions in order to sort of get the ball going, I guess. It was done off the cuff, so definitely not well fleshed out for the video. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I don't expect it to be fleshed out or anything like that. I mean, if I were to make an ethics video, it would be probably fairly difficult. I mean, outside of the ones that I give a lecture on when I teach my class in philosophy. So, well, we'll see how it is. This looks like a combination of more meta ethics with normative ethics and practical ethics all at the same time. What is your educational background? My educational background is going to be in psychology and philosophy, literature, and history. I did all four of those, so you know I took classes in all four. So yeah, so feel free to ask any more questions.
I don't think you should ever kill a human being ever. Well, except in that case, not gonna. Okay, well, wait, hold on. Clearly, you don't believe that. Then there's something else you believe. Let's get to the root of that. Let's find out what you actually, right? My general belief is, I feel like if you have a certain political position, I feel like.
It's okay. Before we begin that, do you know any books that go into psychology of certain philosophical perspectives? It's an interesting question. I've never been asked that before. I mean, I know there's a lot of books basically within cognition, and the cognitive sciences are basically going to be fleshed out in some philosophy of mind. So you're going to have to do some investigation within the philosophy of mind. And there are Oxford books within just like the philosophy of mind. I can give a recommendation for the one that I read, if you'd like. Give me just a second while I go get it. Yeah, the one that I read was by Chalmers, David Chalmers, and or at least it was edited by David Chalmers. But they have a lot of different types of perspectives on the philosophy of mind there. And I know they're probably going to talk about generally probably some of the psychology behind that and the neuroscience behind that, since particularly analytic philosophy doesn't want to divide those two too much, but I mean they will divide it in some sense. I wager some psychologists have analyzed Nietzsche. I'm sure it's happened. I mean, there's all sorts of things. Anyways, let me backpedal.
My general belief is I feel like if you have a certain political position, I feel like it should be justified. What I mean is, I feel like we should have logically coherent and consistent ways by which we take questions, apply some rigorous moral standard to them, and then generate answers that will be consistent with the answers that we'd give to any other question. So there's two parts to this. One, if something is not consistent, it is meaningless. Okay? What I mean is that in any given system, you have rules for that system. If you
Just FYI, coherent and consistent mean the same thing.
You decide that you can break some rules, then you could break any rule, because it doesn't make sense to have a system where some rules can be broken. That means that you're actually using another system, right? Does that make sense? Like if you're saying like, okay, I don't think that you should ever kill a human being ever. Well, except in that case, okay, well, wait, hold on. Clearly, you don't believe that then. There's something else you believe. Let's get to the root of that. Let's find out what you actually, right? So it's important to have a system where all the rules they make sense. I'm sorry, when I say they make sense, where all the rules are consistent, so you always follow them. They're like, you have to do this, otherwise it falls apart. And then you should be consistent throughout the entire rule set.
So there's nothing wrong with this so far. It's sort of
If you
trivial.
believe
It's sort of trivial, I think, that when one does ethics, or actually when one does epistemology or metaphysics, that their statements have to be coherent / consistent. Consistency is the sort of hallmark of a good system. If your beliefs somehow don't line up, then they're not. Then you can't have any sort of system. One of the sort of minimal qualifications, and since this really goes further back, this goes into the theories of rationality. One of the minimal forms of qualifications for rationality is consistency. But not just that, but there's other types of qualifications, minimal qualifications for a theory of rationality. Hold on just 1 second. This is gonna go back to when I I can't find it. I'm gonna have to go off the cuff if I can't find my notes on something. It's here somewhere. It's here somewhere. Give me just a second, guys. Give me just a freaking second while I find something on this very subject before I forget it. I might not be able to find it in my notes because I take so many fucking notes and might not be able to find my notes. Oh yeah, okay, sure. So yeah, as I was saying, there's a little bit more to theories of rationality than consistency. There's also completeness and continuity. So obviously you can't hold a moral system or any sort of rational system if you don't have any sort of continuity within your actions. That is, that if I hold any sort of belief P, say P is that I believe I shouldn't murder dogs, you can't really have a moral or a rational system, or say I believe in dogs just existing, that's a P, if you don't have some level of continuity. That is, I have to believe it at least in 5 seconds and 10 seconds in order for me to be a rational agent. There has to be some sort of continuity. And there also has to be a set of completeness. That is just contemplating a different sets of systems, or a range of different types of options that one can take within their ethical system or in their epistemological system before one adopts a certain type of belief. So those are just a few more qualifications, and one has to understand there's a really good book on this by John Elster, that I haven't unfortunately finished, but me and my friends started it, and it was pretty good, and it gets into a lot of these sorts of topics. It's about theories of rationality and how there's, thin theories of rationality and thick theories of rationality, and sort of what you'd expect is that depending on how thick that your theory of rationality is, it's going to take into consideration more types of restrictions and more types of norms. One of those norms in a thin theory is that you just have to be consistent, and your beliefs can't contradict each other. But if you have a thicker theory of rationality, then ethical norms, such as that I believe that killing is wrong, the inverse of that belief isn't going to lead you to a logical contradiction, right? Now, believing both of those will lead you to a moral contradiction, because you can't believe that, but just believing one of them won't lead to a contradiction. And so you don't have to adopt that view, and some people will take like a moral relativist view because there's no logical contradiction involved in not believing in it. But you have to sometimes adopt a form of ethical commitments, I think, that have their own sort of moral modality. That is, when one contemplates ethics, one can't just talk about possible world semantics. One has to sort of incorporate a sort of metaphysical semantics or an ethical semantics that is consistent with itself and excludes certain types of beliefs that would be morally repugnant, but nonetheless one can hold even if they hold no logical contradiction.
We can't do something that should be consistent throughout all or whatever, blah, 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 with reasonable addendums, or additions, changes. You need to be consistent. It needs to be logically coherent. When I try very hard to do this, even though I don't know if anybody believes this, when I say the word logical or rational, what I mean by that is like premise, conclusion. So if I say you have a logically coherent argument, I might say something like, you should never kill somebody unless you're threatened. Joe represented a threat to Susan. Therefore, Susan can kill Joe. Something like that, right? Like it should follow like either a syllogism or some like reasonable pattern of like, oh, well, if I believe these three things, then this conclusion logically follows. Any moral system you have should be logically coherent, okay? It like makes sense when you line all the statements up, and it should be consistent. You like have the same set of rules you apply everything to, okay? Ideally, if I were to ask, so I feel like when people are asked a question, how do you feel about this thing? There's usually two things that people's minds go to. One is, do I have a visceral reaction to it, right? So if I say, how do you feel about eating shit? Oh, fuck. I have a sense. I've got a sense that like immediately says this is bad. It's the first thing people appeal to. And then the second thing people appeal to is, what is the correct answer that I'm supposed to give given the groups that I belong to? I think that that's the second answer you give. When people run out of those two things, most people don't actually have a rigorous process by which they can evaluate whether something is good or bad, or whether they do or don't like something. I think that that's like that's something that I strongly believe in. Maybe people will disagree with that, but yeah. So for instance, if I say, how do you feel about socialized healthcare? Well, we don't have an initial like a sense response to that. Okay, well, what groups do I belong to? Okay, I'm a liberal, I'm a blah, 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 blah. Oh, okay, cool. I like universal healthcare, right? That's generally it. Now, they might think they know some justifications, but really what they're doing is they're just going to repeat what they heard from the group, knowing that they have to support it. Yeah, because it's the group or whatever. What I want is I want to have some internal system that I've designed that allows me to take moral questions and generate moral answers, okay? Like, that's important to me. That's very important to me.
This is so far just, I think, trivial of any ethical system that you can't appeal to your friends or the vast amount of people, and one can't appeal to their feelings.
One of the most important things to me. So how do we do this?
I mean, a moral system is cognitive, so you need to have more. You need to have moral propositions.
The very first question that we have to start off at, we have to go all the way back. Okay, is we have to ask, what is goodness? Like, what do we consider to be the good? in my actual opinion, this question is unanswerable. This is a question that the answer to this question is going to draw on something external of like human knowledge. Good is an ill-defined concept. I don't believe that there's an actual answer, blah, 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 blah. So I have like my own little answer for goodness, basically, okay? And I'll walk you through this a little bit, okay? So
there's a certain sense of where we can't define goodness because we're always going to move from the universal notion of goodness to the particular notion of goodness. But goodness is expressed through particular instances, and particular instances are exemplified through the universal. That is, that we understand the particular through the universal, and the universal is always understood through the particular. There's always a sort of circularity involved in knowing the two. But I think I might leave it there for now. There seems to also be this this position, I guess, taken in philosophy a lot within the internet, is that you need to explicitly be able to define goodness in order to be a moral agent, or in order to make ethical judgments. But I mean, there's this sort of difficulty, I think, between also defining beauty, or even something, let's say, more simple like truth. How are you going to define truth in a non-circular way, right? But no one goes out their way to deny things like truth.
Since I don't believe that there is like an objective good, objective, truthful, good, moral, whatever. I'm not religious. I don't believe in any sort of like moral realism or objective moral truth, because I don't think that we have ways to feel or see morality. I don't think we can sense it or detect it or argue about it. Basically, what I do is...
See, this is also a sort of continuing trend I've noticed with Destiny, and I've actually brought this up to him, is that you do not need sense organs that can see... that can see morality in the same way that I see a chair. Now, there's going to be an experience of morality. That is, there are going to be types of experiences which contain propositional content that are reason-giving. So, for example, I need to see a continuous event of things occurring, right, in order for me to make moral judgments about them. And that event sort of sticks out to me as being morally repugnant or morally permissible. And so I'm going to act on it, and then I'm going to also form beliefs on it. But the idea that we need some sort of sense organ for various types of things as a sort of defeater for moral realism seems to be sort of misguided, in the sense that we don't seem to have a lot of sense organs, notably for a lot of types of things that we believe, like depth perception. And we don't really... As far as I know, I mean, a lot of sort of mathematical properties or semantical properties, like properties about language, don't seem to, what people are uttering, right, seem to be completely determined by a certain type of sense organ. So the sense organ argument, I think is sort of weak.
I say that there are things that I have that I want to fulfill in my life that make me happy. Those things are, to me, those things are good. So I basically have some like internal happiness. I try to maximize and fulfill my own internal happiness. Well, I'll just call this IH. You guys have to remember what this shit stands for. If this is like what I'm trying to maximize, right? My goal is to live a life where I can satisfy this like internal happiness as much as humanly possible. Now, typically, okay, because I'm not a god, all right.
So this is going to be sort of controversial, I think. The idea that we need to serve a thing called internal happiness is consistent with multiple forms of hypotheses. That is to say that we can reach an internal state of happiness, say at least in these two different ways, through long-term strategies and short-term strategies. And short-term strategies might be something like eating ice cream, eating an orange, doing something that immediately is gratifying. And long-term strategies, obviously we have to sort of plan them. That means we have to inhibit our internal happiness at the least in a short-term sense for a long-term sense. And so both of these hypotheses are consistent with the internal happiness, maximizing internal happiness, right? So if they are consistent with if both of these scenarios are consistent with this, we have to choose we have to have a reason why we select one or the other, which just means that we have to have a further reason than internal happiness in order for us to be able to be justified of which one we choose. A reason which goes beyond, I think, hypothetical norms.
Right? I'm not like capable of doing.
Or certain types of non-cognitive, non-propositional events. So if he thinks that internal happiness is some sort of non-propositional state that we're in, and we're always trying to achieve that sort of pleasure in this sense, then that type of emotivism is also going to run into certain types of problems that I've went over in my other videos.
Doing most things on my own. I can't hunt on my own. I can't create clothing. I can't build houses. There's a lot in my life that makes me happy that I need, that I can't provide for myself. What I need to do is I need to get this from other people as well, right? As a side note, I assume that everybody else functions off of this very same moral principle. Now, people are going to argue that they don't, but I think they do.
Well, they don't.
What I call internal happiness, I think they call religion or some other weird bullshit or Kantian deontological. I don't care.
Kantian deontological goals are going to be completely different from internal happiness, because internal happiness is a sort of contingent state of affairs.
I think that most people.
It's not something that we, and what I mean contingent or conditional, I guess, is a better word, is that we only conditionally attempt to gratify ourselves in our own pleasure and our own internal happiness. But there needs to be, at least in my opinion, something unconditional. That is to say, something that is not conditioned by another thing. So, for example, what I mean by unconditioned and conditioned, this is a sort of typical Kantian language, since he's kind of making fun of Kant here, is that let's say that I like riding motorcycles or something like that. Well, I can ask well, why do I like doing that? Well, because I like the air in my face. I like the speed, the sort of feeling of speed. So one might say that riding a motorcycle is conditioned upon other types of values that I have. But then one can ask, well, why do I have those types of values, right? And those types of values have to be conditioned by other types of values until we get to sort of an unconditioned set of values that are either prescribed by the nature of a human being, maybe a particular human being, or they're prescribed by certain theoretical accounts of practical reason, meaning our reason that handles morality. And so there might be a sort of unconditional norms that a moral agent must follow as a rational moral agent. So that's the sort of Kantian perspective that we've gotten over. But he's going to say it's internal happiness.
People try to satisfy some internal preferences they have. So what I realize is I can't satisfy these on my own, so I have to satisfy these by way of interacting with other people. In order for them to be motivated to satisfy my internal happiness, I have to do something that increases their happiness as well, right? So like economics, I wouldn't say that happiness is like...
Can you give me an example of what problems that emotivism runs into? Just a quick one. Well, I mean, so I'm kind of deflationary about some of this. There's larger problems that one can, if I had some preparation beforehand, go over issues of non-cognitivism. But I mean, for the time being, to give a sort of not so interesting account, is that I think that moral judgments, propositional statements, seem to have their own type of nature to them. Namely, their own type of nature is that they're propositional. And they seem to have at least one quality, which does not seem to be reducible to something non-propositional, such as emotive states. So emotive states don't actually tell us if anything is true or false, they just kind of are. But whereas with morality, there does seem to be propositional states, there does seem to be sort of disagreement upon things. One can at least say minimally that the disagreement is among subjects. But if we do that, right, we are already outside of emotivism, I think. We're inside of the scope of propositional statements about moral beliefs that are at least internal and sort of a matter of our preferences. Is Aristotle's Nimachean ethics the universal standard? I don't know what you mean by universal standard.
It's like a zero-sum game, right? So if one person on his own can generate 5 units of happiness and another person can generate 5 units of happiness, I think that these two people coming together could generate 50 units of happiness.
Oh god. So this is a huge problem, right? This is a big problem when we start talking about pursuing happiness like classic British empiricists, like Mill, of where we think that happiness could just be calculated in terms of utils or overall amounts of pleasure or something like that. Well, we went over with my video with John, one of the problems of consequentialism, and therefore some of the problems with some forms of utilitarianism, of where happiness isn't this linear trend of where everyone can sort of compatibly and systematically be in internal harmony with one another to increase the overall amount of pleasure. Why? Because obviously happiness doesn't work that way. If I don't have A in some scenarios, then I will have B, and if I don't have B in some scenarios, I will have A. Why? Because they're incompatible theses. So, for example, if it makes me extremely happy to be the richest man on earth, but it also makes me extremely happy that I am poorer than everyone else, right? These are obviously ethically incompatible beliefs. One cannot possibly hold these two, and therefore I have to sacrifice one over the other. Not just for the sake of consistency, but I mean, consistency is obviously one of those types of things. It might be for the sake of some sort of deontological duty of some sort as well. But again, there are just all these sorts of conflicting among just a community of people, set of incompatible ethical views. And we can only hold so many of them. And it becomes to be very dicey which ones we have to regulate and which ones we don't, even though both of them might be appealing in some sort of sense.
The more people that work together, the more overall like happiness that you get. So if I agree with this, right? So I want to be happy and I want to maximize the amount of happiness for myself. I need to have other people around me that are capable of like feeding into my own happiness, right? I have to have like a group of people, family and friends, society, whatever you want to call it, that are capable of like satisfying the needs that I have, right? So this might be, we'll just put like house, clothes, friendship, subs. If I have my internal happiness that I'm trying to have satisfied through other people, through these things, right? I would assume that they have their own internal happiness as well. So we kind of have to like enter this like exchange where like I'm offering things, they're offering things, and then together we all kind of work to build upon this type of like happiness through every person. This is like roughly my moral view of like how the world works. I think that everybody's trying to satisfy things that make them happy individually, and I think
so this is going to be a form of what I think to be, at least so far, some type of ethical conventionalism that amounts to being no more than an ethical fiction. So we have to act as if though there is morality in order to satisfy certain types of needs. But none of these ethical standards or norms really exist. They're just sort of useful fictions, right?
that we do that by satisfying each other's like desires and wants, so that we all like kind of like work off of each other's happiness, make each other's happiness. Is there an argument against this idea? I think this is the best way to view things. I think that if you go through this model, I think it gives you a good understanding of how other people work. I think it gives you a good approach to other relationships. I think it gives you a good approach to how the world works.
So that wasn't an answer. I mean, there are a number of alternative meta-ethical views that one can look at that he didn't go over. which is going to be all of these, right? So just the cognitivist theories like moral realism, and then you get basically subsets of moral realism, which is ethical naturalism, ethical non-naturalism, ethical subjectivism, which is ideal observer theory, divine command theory, error theory, non-cognitivist theories. And then you basically can talk about the ontology of these moral norms, whether you're a universalist or a relativist, whether you're a monist or a pluralist, or a nihilist, right? And then you could talk about the epistemology of how we got to these things, whether morality is something innate, whether it's a priori, or whether it's empirically gotten, and whether there's an empirical ideal observer. And then you can, of course, just believe in ethical intuitions or moral skepticism of some sort. So, I mean, there's competing theories for morality that he needs to.
If we take this little mini model here to be true, from this position, we get into this kind of world where we have, I guess you could call this a form of like social contract. So basically, what this is I agree to respect some rights that you have, and you agree to respect some rights that I have, and then by way of doing that, we all kind of like ensure this like better world for all of us. However, it should be noted, okay, the only reason, okay. That's like on an individual personal level, right? Okay, so, all right. I would say that all of this up here, okay, roughly, all right, in the philosophy browsing retrievers, I would say like roughly up here, I would call this like meta ethics, kind of.
I don't think social contract theory is meta ethics. Yeah. So I guess the idea of looking at the perspective of internal happiness as being basically what grounds ethics, a type of ethical subjectivism, and coupled with social contract theory. I mean, the second part might be normative ethics, and the first part might be meta ethics in some sort of degree, but not a form of robust meta-ethical concerns.
Basically, I'm trying to figure out like, well, what do I consider good? Technically, it's a little bit deeper than that, but whatever, right? So this is like good, okay? This is the goodness. The goodness is other people make you happy, you make other people happy, okay? Boom. All right. Now, if I want to figure out like, how do I apply this consistently throughout all of society? How do I create a society where everybody thinks this and we all work together and everybody's happy, blah, 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 blah. We're going to call this little bullshit is basically, this is going to be something called rule utilitarianism, okay? Which is like a little branch of consequentialism. So this is a fancy way of saying what I would want to do is I want to craft a set of rules for society, okay, that I believe maximizes the happiness of every single individual. The rule here might be something like, I don't think anybody should steal from anybody else without provocation. Because if we have a society, for instance, where people are stealing, right, you're literally detracting from another person's happiness for your own selfish gain. And if everybody started to engage in that behavior, it would be a race to the bottom where everything would be fucked, right? So like a good rule for society would be no stealing, right? I think that's like without provocation, right? So you can make arguments for things like taxes or whatever later on, but yeah. How do you come up with the rules? Do you self-reflect / does it come from yourself? So like a rule would just be anything that like I think would maximize like my personal happiness. So I'm being a little bit vague or vacuous with the term personal happiness there.
The real question is that why do you select long-term strategies that would aid you in your overall happiness as opposed to short-term strategies? Why is the principle of prudence something that one selects for as opposed to not?
Because what I'm assuming is,
because I mean, there's a reason why you inhibited your pleasure-seeking goals and decided to do something else, right?
Is the assumption that I without provocation means nothing if you don't define that term. So when I say like provocation, what I mean is like, is there a justification for doing an action that increases the net happiness in society? Is there a justification for performing a certain action that makes everybody better off if everybody like adheres to said action? So for instance, a form of theft that I think would be morally justifiable would be a thing like taxes, okay? So how are taxes justifiable? Because if I steal a little bit from the wealthiest people, the amount that they lose, the impact on their life is going to be very little, but the net gain in happiness between everybody else in society is going to be very high. And also, when everybody else in society is super well off, your net gain in happiness is going to be higher off as well, right? Take, for example, a business owner in a city. If he's
Sometimes. It might not be the case that a society, if you have certain types of values, will work in your
taxed and other
advantage.
people are taxed a little bit higher, everybody else in the city makes more money. That means that that business owner has more people to sell products to. Less of his tax money is being wasted on like crime enforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So theft would be a form of like justified thievery. How do you balance between social well-being and rights? I mean, I would argue that rights that exist, I think, would be an extension of things that contribute to your personal happiness. So for instance, I have a right to bodily autonomy. The reason being, I don't know if I could be happy in a society where other people have a right to use my body against my consent. Generally, I would say that like the function that rights serve is rights are kind of like a shield to protect you from other people fucking with you, right? Rights are something that basically serve to make it so other people can't come in and fuck with your internal happiness.
But I don't think that's a really good definition of right. And I've had a better definition of right, basically, that I gave with Kant, and I don't have the book right next to me. Actually, I do. Whew. Because I will give this definition that I think is better of right. Right is the restriction of each individual's freedom so that it harmonizes with the freedom of everyone else, insofar as this is possible within the terms of general law. And public right is the distinctive quality of the external laws which make the constant harmony possible. And Kant uses the word harmony here, which I find sort of a better description of right. Right isn't that of which necessarily protects your internal happiness. Of course, it does that in some way, but it's made to create a sort of harmony instead of a sort of individualistic notion of happiness, right? It's the inhibition of one's self, giving away oneself for something collectively better than one's own self. And this shouldn't always be portrayed, or at least I don't think so, in a very individualistic light. But the more and the further that I go down this video, this has very, very classic neoliberal agendas.
Basically. So we have rules in society, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so do I want to talk about like tit-for-tat systems? No, I don't think so. If you engage with somebody or if you encounter somebody, okay, I think that all of a successful society is built on this type of exchange. If you find people that are not willing to engage with this type of exchange, then in my opinion, this is going to sound like extreme, but in my opinion, all bets are off. As soon as somebody has proven that they're willing to drop this level of consideration, then I think it's fair to drop your level of consideration for that person as well. This is why I think that there are some people whose views are fundamentally incompatible with what I would consider a well-functioning society. For instance, a group of people that view themselves as racially superior to another people think that it's okay to take certain groups of people and excise them from society. Those groups of people won't be able to live in harmony with the other groups of people because they're trying to be eradicated, and it's going to cause like a lot of disharmony between these groups of people, right? So like highly intolerant groups of people or people that aren't willing to share this social contract with broad groups of people without valid justification. So for instance, if those other people aggressed on them first or whatever, would be people that I would consider like unable to reciprocate like or be a part of like these types of societies. So this is like a general rule, okay? General rule is that I need some reciprocated value here for me to want to reciprocate value with you. Reciprocated values, right? We'll just say that. None of these terms actually mean anything. You can say whatever the fuck you want. Okay. So if we have all of this set up, okay, one of the things that's guaranteed, okay, so we've moved through the meta level. This is the normative level. Now we're getting down to an applied level, okay? If somebody were to talk to me about like, let's say that I have,
that is true though.
Boom, I have my house, okay? Me feeling like I have a house and me feeling like the security of that house is guaranteed to me by society, These are very, very, very important things to me. Okay. I don't want to live in a society where it feels like anybody can take my shit or destroy my shit. I don't think I would consider that society dysfunctional, right? Because if we come back up here, like, what does it mean for me to be happy? Well, for me to be happy, I need to have certain things that are guaranteed to me. People aren't going to steal shit from me. People aren't going to fucking kill me. People aren't going to rape me. People aren't going to take my, like, these are things that, like, are important to me to maintain my happiness. This is like an agreement that I have with everybody else that lives, like, in my society, right? So if I'm in a society and somebody approaches me, okay, and this person is saying, hey, I'm going to destroy your shit, okay, in my view of morality, this person is not reciprocating to me a system that says that they're going to be respectful of.
Destiny has this this type of view that I've kind of noticed. I mean, throughout this video, and I mean, I guess it's apparent. I mean, it's very neoliberal sort of. He has a lot of classic British empiricist tendencies within his philosophy, up to the social contract, innate happiness, maximize pleasure, all these sorts of utilitarian consequentialist norms within his philosophy. And now he's going on to this, like, quasi-Hegelian view of where the state is justified through its internal dialectic, its internal historical dialectic, right? So all of these norms that have been created, all these social contracts, these laws hereout that have been created within history are ultimately justified because what do? They internally justify themselves. They internally go through all of the internal struggles that have developed from society since, I don't know, maybe the pioneers of America. And we've gotten to this point. Why fuck that up? Why try to create some sort of antithetical position which might mitigate or cause disasters within this sort of society, right? So what you're doing here, right, in this move is legitimizing the state. You're legitimizing the social contracts and the theories and the laws, which initially, in my opinion, were legitimized by the moral law, the moral good. And therefore, one has to take into consideration, since we've gotten into a little bit of ethical particularism, I think the times that we're in my opinion, to sort of begin to chisel away at these foundational bedrocks that we've set up. But in this video, it seems to be the exact opposite. It's that we don't want to begin to critique, or at least so far we are not critiquing the state or the society of the norms, we'll call it the polos. But we want to instead legitimize these forms of laws.
All of the things that make me happy.
Why? Because more people will be unhappy, right? But of course, this gets into other types of problems, namely that if you have a state that legitimizes certain types of things like slavery, or legitimate types of institutions, say capitalistic institutions that are going to weigh upon, I don't know, a certain population of people who are poor, obviously it's not going to be fair for them. So it's going to create internal tensions like this as well, right?
Happy. As soon as a person has aggressed on me or aggressed on another person in that manner, where they're attacking this person's like internal happiness, where they're going against what this person like wants to get.
What do you mean by neoliberal? I generally mean certain types of beliefs that, you get these types of beliefs that, you know, you want people to be small government, you want them to have as laissez-faire of economics as possible, free market society, a free exchange of ideas, competition among people, some sort of, generally I see as some sort of basis of trickle down economics working in that mix. I'm thinking about Reagan economics, Thatcher economics, basically that type of trend, or Milton Friedman, or Hayek, right? These sorts of neoliberal engagements or beliefs.
Get out of society in a way that's like a direct attack on their shit. I think that this person has a right to do whatever they need to stop this person from carrying out that aggression.
Yeah, except that's not always the case. We can, in many different scenarios, see of where the state is no longer legitimate. That is, if the state is providing you with the land or with the property that you have, and it is an illegitimate form of force, then the people that are destroying these houses have a form of legitimate concern of which they can destroy these houses given certain types of scenarios. I'm not saying they're always legitimate. I'm just saying they can be legitimized unless you have this unwavering notion of the polos or the state as being something that is always legitimate, right? Always legitimate and always basically something that can be defended because it has historically reached that point.
Yeah. So this is basically where, in a highly abbreviated manner, this is where like I build my model for self-defense. So if you're going
Oh, thanks for subbing. Thank you.
to attack my shit, if you're going to come at me, okay, and then we can add a few more rules to make this more generally favorable for society. So for instance, like I should have some obligation to put this person on notice. Maybe in their internal happiness model, maybe property isn't that important to them, so they actually don't see this attack on me as that egregious. They wouldn't think that like, oh wow, I didn't know that was part of your contract, right? So there should be some obligation to put this person on notice, like, hey, if you attack my house,
I sort of God, I keep sort of pausing too often, but we need to look at social contract theory as something that it doesn't necessarily necessitate. There's a bit of redundancy there, but it doesn't necessitate or ethics, right? It doesn't legitimize everything that it touches. As a matter of fact, the social contract itself needs to be conditioned by something greater than itself. Otherwise, the social contract is between two contingent parties that can do whatever they want, right? So one can just sort of pull back at any point and fuck the other guy over. And if it internally maximizes their happiness, why didn't they? There have to be certain forms of inhibition and certain types of unconditional goods in which the social contract theory is basically founded upon.
I'm gonna fucking kill you, right? I think that you have that obligation to do that before taking action, although I think in society most people should reasonably understand that. And then there are other things that could augment this as well. So for instance, if this person is 4 years old, they probably don't have the cognizant, like, know-it-all, like, or wherewithal to know that they're breaking this contract. We wouldn't expect somebody that's 4 years old to be able to make that decision. If a person is, like, out of their mind on drugs or whatever, then arguably, if we consider them compromised, maybe killing them would be unethical. I don't know. I'd have to think more about that one because they're still threatening to destroy your stuff and they're still engaging in an act that's leading to an action that threatening your mental happiness. But yeah, it's kind of abbreviated, but I think that like this is basically where my argument for self-defense comes from. Another person is not reciprocating with you the contract that we all agree to live by in society and has shown a disregard for things that make you happy. Therefore, I don't believe in any sort of objective morality or anything. I don't think you have an obligation to protect this person against their own harmful wishes. Their harmful wishes being to destroy your property and then endure any harm that might result from you defending your property. Oof, okay, there it is. Destiny, would you agree that killing a 4-year-old would be justified to save your
So far, this is very cookie cutter.
livelihood if there was no other way, right? It's possible. So the way that I would explain this is that if a 4-year-old was in a position to, okay, so this is a little bit complicated, right? So I don't consider 4-year-olds to be moral agents, meaning I don't know if they could do something that I would truly consider to be right or wrong. Since they're not moral agents of their own, I would consider a 4-year-old, that is a human being, to be an extension of their parent, a form of property, basically. So if a...
Whew. So maybe someone can spell out the inference from me, but babies aren't moral agents. Therefore, somehow, magically, they're property.
A 4-year-old is out causing significant harm to you, and you have to kill that 4-year-old. I can't even imagine how this could be the case. But if that was the case, then the responsible party for that would be the parent of that 4-year-old for letting them get into a place where they can actually cause that harm. So, for instance, actually, we can spin up an example of this. This is a good question. So we spin up an example of this. What if I'm driving down the street and then a 4-year-old child starts crawling in front of the street, right? Out of nowhere, a fucking ninja 4-year-old starts crawling, or not crawling, I guess, they start running out in the middle of the street, okay? Let's say that I can either swerve, and I swerve off the road, off a canyon, because I'm driving in Maui and Hawaii. I'll swerve off the road, and then I die. Or I have to run over the 4-year-old, right? Well, in that case, well, fuck it. I'm not going to suicide myself. You run over the 4-year-old, okay? You make the decision to kill the 4-year-old to save yourself from great personal harm. Maybe you and your whole family are riding around, right? If that's the case, I think that you're morally justified in killing the 4-year-old, but the responsibility for the death of the 4-year-old lies on the parent of the 4-year-old. The parent was the responsible party of the 4-year-old. The 4-year-old can't make the decision to put your stuff at risk. The parent knows that the 4-year-old is capable of doing that, and by allowing the 4-year-old to roam, you know the risks of that happening in a given area, so you bear the responsibility of any action taken by that 4-year-old. So that would be like
I doubt that that's true in law.
like the chain of responsibility there, basically.
I mean, I think you're responsible for your child as a parent. I think you have to take certain precautions for your child not to murder people, but I don't know if you are actually legitimately held accountable for it in law if your child murders another human being, in the same sense that you'd be accountable if you murdered someone. And that's generally why, kids, I don't know about 4-year-olds, go to juvie and go through certain types of therapy and, go through certain types of institutions which have corrective measures.
Can you apply that logic to defending someone else's property? For sure. So let's say that I have a piece of property, and let's say that I feel like that property is threatened by another person, okay? Another person is going to come and destroy my property. Let's say that they have 5 friends, okay? So let's say 6 people are coming to kill or destroy my property, right? If I know that I can't defend this property on my own, and I know that it's going to significantly curb my, internal happiness,
you get the stake
to lose said property, I think I should be able to reach out to society and say like, hey, can you please help me defend my shit? To some extent, we already have this agreement with police officers, right? Hey, I can't defend my shit. I'm going to make an appeal to the public infrastructure. Can you please come and help me do it, right? In the case that a police officer isn't available, maybe you ask a friend. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that.
Thank you for the follow.
I would expect that if somebody was threatening somebody else, it's okay to ask somebody else for help for it. If I was at a bar and a 6'9" dude came up to me and said he was going to fucking kill me, I would ask a friend for help. I wouldn't be expected to deal with that on my own. I don't think that burden should be placed on the victim of an aggressor. What if people don't follow your rules and that society's fucked, no matter what they do, they get shit on, aka civil disobedience, I don't think that civil disobedience contradicts my system in any way, size, shape, or form. I'd be curious how. I think that people that live with different systems than me are generally incompatible with any reality that I would want to live in. I think that in general, most people have internal preferences that they try to satisfy, and that we ought to be respectful of other people's internal preferences as well. If you have some moral system that makes it so that you can disregard the wills and wishes of other people in aggressive manners, then I would consider you to be, in every sense of the word, an immoral person. And immorality should either be purged or reformed, whatever is more likely, I guess. Destiny, shouldn't everyone more or less agree with all of this? Maybe, I don't know. Do you think that defending random people's businesses with lethal force is justifiable, even though the person doesn't know whether it actually threatens?
Wait, what?
More likely, I guess. Destiny, shouldn't everyone more or less agree with all of this? Maybe, I don't know. Do you think that defending random people's businesses with lethal force is justifiable, even though the person doesn't know
I have no idea what he just said there.
whether it actually threatens their livelihood, like unrequested defensive businesses? I think that anybody that, in my opinion, anybody that thinks it's acceptable to walk around and cause massive destruction to other people's property is incompatible with like a healthy functioning society. Not with private property. With public property, I can see other arguments for it, but not with private property.
I'm not sure. I could see why one would make the divide between private and public property, but I'm just not sure why he has this belief that any form of destruction of private property in a society is going to be illegitimate. I mean, I could see why it makes for an unhealthy society in some sense, in that one would be in sort of constant worry that they can't buy a house because it might be threatened, so the sort of value of the houses would probably decrease, and the amount of people willing to invest in houses would also decrease. But one can probably imagine a great deal of examples of where destruction of property, which isn't the same thing as killing off people, is legitimized.
No, unless they feel that that person has done like an individual wrong to them. So like if anybody wants to defend like anybody's random private property, I think that strangers could do it, and I think it would be morally justifiable.
Thank you for the subscription, Slims20. Thank you. Oh wow, we have 53 people in here all of a sudden.
I don't wheel out this argument because it's obviously a more extreme take, and I'd have to walk through all this to get there. But I think that the concept of defending like private property as a concept can be done much the same way that like you could pull a random person out of a pool, or if you saw somebody's car rolling down a hill, you could run and like try to apply the parking brake or whatever. That like everybody ought to be roped into defending everybody else's stuff. protesting in a street would be justifiable in the system. Sure, of course you can protest if you want. Yeah. Is there anywhere your system breaks? No, I think if a system breaks, then it has to change. It's not a good system. I mean, I wouldn't think so, obviously, but yeah. Destiny, what happens when one person's internal preferences contradict somebody else's? A bad preference is one that demands other people to violate things that would satisfy their own preferences, in my opinion.
But we constantly, I mean, even as I've defined the notion of right before, I mean, you could avoid maybe the Kantian definition of right, but we constantly need to inhibit our own preferences in order to satisfy the needs of other people, in order to have some sort of notion of a harmony. I mean, he even admitted that in his earlier example of us having a set of agreements, social contracts. But presumably, again, all of our interests and preferences are not going to be compatible with the universal trends that are in a society. And as a matter of fact, they could be quite antithetical to a majority of our preferences. But if you do see some sort of communitarian benefits, then one has to inhibit their internal happiness quite often.
There's like an incompatibility there. But I don't think I have any internal preferences that contradict other people's so radically. Or if they do,
Yeah, but harmony is my preference. Gotcha. So, I mean, I've already went over this, Chaser9210. You could say that harmonies are your preferences. As you can say that I have long-term strategies that would increase my overall happiness. But the point is that there are multiple forms of hypotheses that one can generate that are compatible with increasing their internal happiness. And one has to select between those preferences with some reason outside of internal happiness. Else, right, you're not explaining why I'm choosing one preference over the other to increase my internal happiness.
I would argue that I'm correct and they're incorrect, and fuck them. So, like,
see, I mean, put it in another way. This is in Coast Guard, Coast Guard, I think. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Where she basically talks about Kant and the notion of hypothetical norms, which is basically selecting a norm for a certain type of end. Let's say that I want to get big, so I'm going to have to work out, right? So that's a hypothetical norm. What do I seek out for? Getting big, and then I have to find some sort of means of which I fulfill that end. But all hypothetical norms, whether I want to fulfill, say, the hypothetical norm of increasing the overall happiness of society, whether I want to increase my taste buds, whether I want to increase my education, right? All of these forms of hypothetical norms that I select, they're not just branching into very many into different trajectories of where I just arbitrarily select one or the other. I have a further reason of why I'm choosing one hypothetical norm as opposed to another hypothetical norm. So there's a sort of foundational reason, if you will, either cognitive or non-cognitive, and there's the debate of why I'm selecting one hypothetical norm over the other. The hypothetical norms themselves will rest on something other than itself or be conditioned by something other than itself, which needs to be explained. Hypothetical norms free-floating don't tell us anything.
Basically, like, I have an internal preference, for instance, for taxation in society because I believe government provides goods that dramatically increase the well-being of all of its citizens. There might be other people in a society that feel like, oh, well, I totally disagree with taxes. Taxing me is thievery for me. Well, I would say, okay, well, you're incompatible with my society. So I either have to make you bend to my will using force.
Wait. Yeah, Marty, I swear to God, if you mention Destiny once, DGG hears it through either and shows up. Not that's a bad thing. I see it. Okay.
So we do that with police, for instance. Like, you have to pay your taxes or you get arrested.
Yeah,
or we kick you out of society, or we
is
go
that
to war.
better?
It's connected because social contract is the benefit of feeling intuitively valid. However, the application of the system in regards to how people actually feel isn't distinct. Some people feel fucked, thus some protesters and rare, some rioting against the system/your system. I just don't think that in any moral system, I don't think rioting against private property can be okay. I think rioting against public property can be justified pretty easily. But so would you not just be a hedonist? You could I don't know. I'm not trying to label the words or whatever. There's like other we could talk about like egotistical. Psychological egoism or ethical egoism. I don't care about that shit. I'm not. It's just like really basic. We can do this without using any big meme words. Can you define a period?
Why not? I mean, psychological egoism in some way does kind of represent the type of view that Destiny has, which I think puts the cart ahead of the horse. That is to say that when people think that we do everything for the sake of pleasure, one sort of misses the point of why we do things. So, for example, an ethical egoist, or sorry, a psychological egoist would say that when I'm taking a bullet, I'm doing it for the sake of my pleasure. But I think this gets things switched around. Just because there is pleasure as a consequence of my actions, that is, I derive pleasure after the action is over, does not mean that I do every action for the sake of pleasure, right? I do maybe the action for the sake of the good because I think it's the good thing to do, and I might develop pleasure as a consequence of that action. But just developing a consequence for that action does not necessitate that I do it for that reason. And so I'm not really sure how psychological egoism gets off the ground.
That cause mutual respect for property such happiness to fail in our current societal system. I mean, so arguably, if we take this broad concept of self-defense, right? What does self-defense mean? Self-defense means that somebody is aggressing on you in a way that makes it so that you can't satisfy your internal happiness, right? What we could talk about is
I don't think so. So good is propositional and pleasure is non-propositional. So you'll have to reduce the good down to pleasure. And there is a sort of thing called the open question argument. I'm sure a lot of people don't like it and think that it's dismissed easily. But in order for the good to be merely pleasurable, they would have to be analytically identical statements. Actually, they would have to mean the very same thing, which I think one has to go ahead and prove in some sort of way. I don't think it's intuitively plausible to say that they're identical. So the statements, it's good, but is it good, is obviously a sort of odd question to ask. Well, in virtue of something being good, it obviously has an identity with being good. But when I ask, it's good, but is it pleasurable, or it's pleasurable, but is it good, right? I'm asking two sets of questions right there. They don't have the exact identity statement. They're not the exact same thing. I'm opening up the question of what something means to be good to the floor, if you will. I'm putting it on a pedestal and asking what exactly are the sort of sufficient conditions that I could say that would meet the criterion of good. And it doesn't seem like they're always pleasure-seeking activities.
Could talk about the black...
Because something could, I mean, and for example, something can, not bring me immediate sort of pleasure, but I would still pursue
black
it.
Community at large, okay? So the black community has a feeling that the United States as a whole is aggressing on them in a way that's preventing them from satisfying this internal happiness. So whether that's the perpetuation of systemic racism in forms of like criminal justice system, in forms of poor funding for schools, in forms of redlining and gentrification that's pushing on homes, right? Black people might have this feeling. If that's the case, then black people are morally justified in protesting or fighting against this system. Black people would have an argument there. And since earlier I said it's totally fair for us to defend other people who feel like they're being aggressed on, because we would want other people to defend us if we're feeling aggressed on, I would expect non-black people as well to be able to join those black people in terms of protesting what they perceive to be aggressions towards whatever's satisfying their internal happiness. It's like where the justification for protest would come from. Protests are not, so in my worldview, a protest is not a form of aggression. A protest is a form of self-defense against somebody else's aggression, is how I would view it. I think there's a difference between law enforcement defending someone's property and random people defending people's property without being asked to. I think the latter is reckless and is more likely to lead to people getting hurt or killed. So we can talk about like the actual application of somebody defending property, because that could be done imperfectly. However, that's not really the moral argument. That's more like that would be more like a practical argument. In a practical manner, strangers defending other people's property could be so imperfect that it's hard to morally justify it. That could be true, but however, you can also kind of sort of make you can make an argument against even calling the police for this. So for instance, some people would argue that it's not fair to deport somebody because they're stealing from a store, so therefore it could be immoral to call the police on robbers because they might be illegal immigrants and they'll get deported if they get caught, right? So or maybe somebody's breaking into your place, well, I could go handle this myself, but if I call the cops might kill the person, right? So you could technically make that argument anywhere if the practical application is low enough. I guess it's up to an individual to feel like if the practical application of their belief belief can be done in a way that's morally responsible. So for instance, if you were like an ex-cop, or you've got a lot of like training with your firearms, and you feel like you can handle yourself responsibly, maybe you're a bouncer, bodyguard, whatever, and you want to go and defend a piece of property, then like you're probably okay to do so, right? That's up to you to figure that out. Destiny, do you think anyone actually disagrees with what you laid out here? I feel like lefties are just being partisan to their side. I don't know. I'm just laying it out just so people can see, I guess.
A lot of people would disagree with this.
Haven't you said before that you think vigilantism is stupid? Would any form of going out of your way to defend someone else be vigilantism? Okay, so I know this sounds like a meaningless distinction, but when I say something is stupid, that's way fucking different than saying something can be morally justified, okay? If somebody punches you in the face, okay, at a bar, I think you could be morally justified in punching them back if you wanted to. But I think it's stupid because the threat that you're increasing the likely threat to yourself, you're not going to de-escalate the situation. You could represent greater potential harm in the future. I think it's really dumb. But I think you have justification to do it if you really want to. I'm not going to say like, dude, I'm not going to say like, that was wrong of you to do. What I might say instead is that was stupid of you to do, right? I think those are meaningfully different things. If protesting is self-defense and lethal force is justified in self-defense, couldn't you justify rioting? Well, I think...
Trying to think about if you can maintain the distinction between stupid and unjustified. If all unjustified really means... Well, I'm not even sure what it really means to talk about things being unjustified. So he's basically saying that things are unjustified if they're if they're not in accordance with the social contract theory. But the social contract theory is basically going to be grounded in distinct forms of internal happiness that are somehow compatible. Yeah, I mean,
I think that as part of self-defense, we should probably take like the minimum level of force necessary to convince the other party that what they're making is a mistake, right? Basically, that if somebody is infringing on your internal happiness, that doesn't give you carte blanche to instantly kill them, but you use escalating measures to stop them from doing something, so that rather than killing them instantly. So, for instance, if protests are a form of self-defense against an aggressive government, well, then you slowly escalate the protests until, I mean, like in some cases, maybe a protest gets the job done. If it doesn't, maybe rioting. If it doesn't, then maybe fucking civil war.
So he's okay with civil war, and he's okay with rioting.
Protest gets the job done. If it does,
so he's not. So, I mean, it's just like this entire presentation of legitimizing certain types of internal forms of happiness and creating a social contract theory and being able to defend your house, right, goes out the door as soon as you mention that you're okay with certain types of riots and certain types of civil war if the actual state is illegitimate. So what makes then, therefore, the state illegitimate? Well, it's not the social contract. It's not, some sort of private laws that we've created. Those can be ungrounded the moment that there is something illegitimate about it.
Doesn't, maybe right.
And it doesn't seem like the vast majority of people being internally happy is what legitimates it either.
Fighting, if it doesn't, then maybe fucking civil war, If there was a strong threat of protest evolving into rioting and looting, wouldn't the police be justified in preemptively shutting them down according to your system? It's possible. Like, if you thought that there was such an extreme level of harm that would be disproportionate in counter to the other harm being committed. So if the defenders were preparing to enact an extreme form of harm in response to a perceived aggression, I think you could preemptively shut down defenders. Sure. So if I were to think of a small example of this, let's say that somebody at a bar is walking up to somebody and they're kind of drunk and they want to punch this dude, okay? I'm drunk and I'm going to punch you because you're black and I hate you, okay? All right, and the black guy sees the dude and he's like, oh, okay. Now, I think that the black guy could be morally justified in punching him back, okay? I'm just using black guys. Maybe the guy's racist, but whatever. The guy could be justified in punching him back, but what if I see that the other guy has a knife in his back pocket and he reaches to pull that knife out, right? I think that you could run up to the guy that's holding the knife and knock him out, okay? Even though he technically hasn't done anything wrong yet, but like if you perceive that he's about to respond to an aggressor with an insanely disproportionate level of force, like more than he needs to shut down the aggression, then I think that you could preemptively take actions against him. Sure. So protesting is valid if you've got like good reason to believe that protests could turn massively fucking violent and cause a disproportionate amount of damage in relation to what they're protesting, then I think that you could be justified in shutting that down beforehand. Yes. This is often done in Europe when police hear that football hooligans join protests and there is a large chance of riots. They forbid the protests. Sure. Destiny, is an individual morally justified in defending all the property they own, or are they only morally justified in their property it's necessary for their survival? The former statement is true. Where would the line be drawn as to when? I think that all private property is defensible. I don't want to live in a society, okay? I do not want to live in a society.
So So I still haven't seen really an argument, I guess, um, showing the defense of private property. So there's all sorts of philosophers that defend this notion. What's one philosopher that defends this notion? Well, actually, Kant does, despite him being an anti-Kantian. So does Hegel. So do all the Brits. But what in essence has Destiny offered that defends private property altogether at this point? Nothing, as far as I've seen, right? And I'm not saying I would run this hypothesis, or sorry, this thesis, but let's say that we're anarchists, we're Proudhonians or whatever, right? And if anyone's read Proudhon, he would, within the first 20 or 30 pages, ask a very simple question: what gives us the right to property or private property to begin with? There might be certain types of natural rights that one could hold, and so you believe in natural rights like the right to freedom of speech, whatever. But where is exactly on that sheet or that list of rights that guarantees private property? Well, we'd have to do sort of a genealogy of what defends private property, right? We'd have to go down the sort of historical pathway of how we dialectically came to this historical moment of where it's legitimized. And one could do that type of theory, and then one sort of finds the foundations of how this is sort of structured, and then one sees that what really structures it is a handful of things, such as someone getting to a piece of land before someone else, someone laboring upon that piece of land, someone putting down a minimum set of, I don't know, finances in order to purchase that land, and then that land is then going to be something that is adopted by their future families, and then they're going to, without needing to labor upon it, just have it in virtue or in fiat of the other person having it, and this just continues down a long chain of historical examples. And that's sort of, in a very, very minimalistic way, a minimalistic sort of overview of Proudhon's kind of theory, is that nothing really in the beginning legitimizes the sort of private property that was originally crafted, other than some guy laboring 200 years ago, and then, someone legitimately gets it through law, which is another way of saying force, these property rights later on. Or it could just be basically, banks or whoever owns this type of property at this point that gets to use that property as a form of exploitation. So I'm not trying to go towards an anarchist or a Marxist overview of all these types of things, but there are alternative forms of arguments that one can give, and you'd hope that at least you'd have a argument for why property rights are legitimized. So one could, for example, make the distinction between possession and ownership. One could possess a house, one could use the house, and as soon as they are no longer using the house, they no longer can possess the house, and therefore someone else moves in, right? And someone can have arguments like this. And then you're going to ask normal questions like, oh, well, if you don't own the house, then how's law? How are you going to prevent people from going in it and stealing all your stuff? Well, I mean, you could still have laws. You could still have basically your house protected if you have possession over it. But the point is that you don't get ownership over it if you're not using it and are in somewhere else across the country. But whatever type of theory that you have, you're going to have to provide some sort of proof for how this is ultimately legitimized. And there are certain types of philosophers that do it. Like I said, Kant basically gives, I think, I don't want to over commit myself, but I think he gives like an a priori argument for why we have the right to private property, why it is a necessity in a society
where my shit can be fucking destroyed and I have no way to stop it. That would be like an important part for my internal happiness. If I want to be able to defend my stuff from a would-be aggressor, I ought to have the right to do that. Morality is more complicated than internal happiness. I disagree. I will wholly argue and stay mad. All of metaethics is fucking trash.
That's funny.
garbage, waste of time. It's philosophers that are bored as fuck circle jerking against other philosophers that are bored as fuck because they're just out of circle jerk. Fuck everything about meta ethics and figure out what is actually good bullshit. All of us have things in life that we want. We try to satisfy those wants. That's all morality is, okay? So everybody who disagrees, suck a dick.
So that's not an argument. That's not an argument. It might be what you would call a go-to position in ethics, but it's one that one has to justify. And what justification is there in this video? There isn't.
Were the militia in the Kenosha case generally defending property, or were they counter-protesters attempting to intimidate a combination of protesters and rioters? I mean, that's a question that seems hard to answer. However, based on the videos that I've seen, okay, like we have to, what I think is really important is to look at the order of aggression, okay? So in Kenosha, my understanding is that one, there was a curfew, okay? So if we're out past curfew, now we have one level of aggression from the protesters that has already put the other side on the defense, right? Because if you're violating curfew, there could be reasons why. Now, maybe they're just there to continue to protest, in which case, oh, fuck it, curfew's fine.
Yeah, so someone's asking a question in the chat room. As someone who doesn't know jack shit about philosophy other than Destiny's trash meta-ethical take, I don't wanna include the trash on my own opinion. I'm wary that philosophy is some sort of thing that I need to hide behind to be a more rational being or something like that. I think people who don't know metaethics just don't know metaethics because they haven't read the literature, and there's all sorts of reasons why someone wouldn't read that literature, and they'd be preoccupied with other things. So it's fine if he doesn't know it, but I guess his cavalier nature and his just kind of general dismissive attitude is what I don't like about this video so far. But anyways, I did actually go over what I think are some of the sort of problems when he went over the meta-ethical concerns. Even though he said it's trash, he went over the meta-ethical concerns, which I thought was sort of funny. And one of the meta-ethical concerns is that I don't think that we can just sort of, in the end of the day, say everything is just a matter of trying to find happiness as the sort of ultimate maxim that we all follow. And it's really hard to see whether or not happiness is the same thing as pleasure for him. It might be, in which case that runs into some sort of problems. What are some of the types of problems that I talked about already in the stream? Well, one of the types of problems is that ethical judgments, any sort of judgment such as this is the torturing of cats is wrong, the protection of property is generally justified. These types of statements seem to be propositional. They seem to, that is, that they're semantically built. They are generally in the form of either being true or false, that is, they're cognitive, and they're going to be something that one can be persuaded out of or not out of. And so one is going to use some set of arguments, basically, in order to persuade them out of that. And this, I think, and I feel, is no more or any real different than ordinary epistemological claims, such as that I have any sort of belief in P, such that I can someone can tell me the inverse of it, not P, and then convince me out of it through a set of reasons, and then I make that set of inferences. It doesn't just seem like I just feel something, and that's just all it means to talk about certain types of moral propositions, right? So that's just if his thing is reducible to cognitivism, non-cognitivism. Another problem with non-cognitivism is that anytime you're going to say that these propositional beliefs, these moral propositional beliefs, are reducible to a set of dispositional properties, such as emotions, or let's say certain types of bodily states like neuron X firing, you're going to need to make an identity statement. And in order to make an identity statement, you have to argue for that identity statement. You're going to have to say that these are nothing more than that. And you have to give a reason for why they're nothing more than that. You can't just merely say they're nothing more than that, because at least from a phenomenological standpoint, these entities seem to be right there, right in front of you, existing, right? I'm not going to start denying that I don't have beliefs until people give me good reasons why I don't have beliefs and they're actually reducible to certain types of things. And I think they're just as justified as seeing things like trees or bushes or whatever. The idea that moral statements don't exist, right, seems to be something you would normally be suspicious of. So I don't have a reason, at least myself, there could be a few more arguments later down the road, we've gone through these in other videos, of why we should just basically say ethics are sensations, pleasurable sensations, or reduced down to pleasurable sensations, or reduced down to certain types of natural things. Plus, getting rid of normativity altogether seems impossible to me. And that's what dispositions generally tend to be. Causal dispositions is that they're non-normative content. And propositional statements seem to be normative all the way down, actually. What do I mean by normative? I mean that there's a rule that we're prescribed that we are either in or out of accordance with. So say the moral rule that we ought not to kill cats arbitrarily, whatever, any type of moral statement. That has a certain type of norm that I need to be in or out of accordance with. But say brain states, well, if you don't take a teleological view of brain states and you don't view brain states as being something fundamentally normative already, then they're generally just causal states, dispositional tendencies that just occur, right? Nature just kind of does what it does. It doesn't have a reason for doing what it does, but ultimately our ethical judgments do have a reason for what they do, and they have a prescribed rule that they want to be in accordance with. So this reduction from the normative to the non-normative is essentially what I would sort of attack as being impossible, and that's for attacks against non-cognitivism. Now, the attacks against, again, form of cognitivism, but say ethical subjectivism, in which we value certain types of beliefs like our own happiness. I value the propositional statement that my happiness is good. Again, that hypothesis, or sorry, that statement or that belief can be justified in a multiplicity of ways. That means I can do a lot of things that can increase my happiness. But why am I selecting one over the other? Why am I, say, selecting short-term versus long-term strategies? Well, there has to be a reason outside of those. That is to say, those have to be conditioned into something unconditioned. I can't just merely say I follow this pleasure just for its own sake, because then it would be a brute fact. I have to say, instead, because I have certain types of values that I'm committed to outside of these, that I own up to, that I prescribe myself to, certain types of categorical norms of which I prescribe myself to, that therefore situate me in making other types of decisions. So hopefully that's not too complicated, and if it is, I suggest watching one of the other videos that I've listed out under my YouTube channel. And again, my YouTube channel is listed right there on the top of the screen. It is the Philosophy Chat under YouTube.
However, if they're violating curfew and they start to show that they have the likelihood or the proclivity to start to destroy property, well, then they're continuing to up the level of aggression.
Yeah, moral anti-realism just means that there's no fact of the matter whether a propositional statement is true. And as far as I take it, I don't think Destiny is saying that unless he's confused. And people have to really differentiate between an error theory and ethical subjectivism and ethical particularism and ethical relativism and ethical anti-realism, right? These all mean different things. People compound them together, but they don't mean the exact same thing. One has to be very, very careful about how they use their terminology.
If this is true, then people that are there for the express purpose of defending property, like, I think that by virtue of having guns out, you've put the other side on notice. Like, hey, you start fucking shit up, like, we've got guns, like, don't do it or whatever. As long as they're making like reasonable efforts to maintain their position and not like also aggress. Although at that point, it's hard to say that the people with the guns there are aggressing more when the protesters are already out past curfew and still contributing to destruction of property. What if you got a bunch of white supremacists to defend your property against BLM protests and are black people? Wouldn't this practical application do more harm than good if these people have a motivation to harm more people? It doesn't really matter who's defending. I'll drop my hot take because I don't really give a fuck. It doesn't matter if it's Nazis or white nationalists or whoever defending your property. Much the same that for BLM, it doesn't matter if it's like black nationalists or Nation of Islam that are protesting, right? We have to look at the individual actions that these people are taking. Just because you might be a bad person or just because you might have some bad moral beliefs doesn't mean that every action you take, therefore, past that has become become bad. That's not how we determine whether an action is good or bad. A bad person can do neutral or good things. A good person can do neutral or bad things. If like a bunch of white nationalists or black nationalists or whatever show up to defend a piece of property or whatever, then as long as they're not engaging in aggressive behavior or aggressing on another side, they have their right to do that. What should someone do if guns are illegal except your own house in his country and there were the same riots happening in the city? I don't know. It depends if you have I don't know. That gets more complicated. I mean, it depends on how you get a gun and everything. Yeah. Destiny, the gun people are out past curfew, so the curfew is a wash. No, that is not true. The gun people are only out past curfew because of the aggression of the protesters out past curfew. If the protesters leave, the gun people leave as well. So no, that is not true. The curfew and the violation of curfew would be on the protesters. To be clear, protesters...
The reason why he has that belief is because he's already settled on the matter that what is being legitimized, the state, the police, the city, the houses, if that's legitimate, then everything else will be illegitimate. I mean, but we need to go up through these sets of inferences to see why he got to that conclusion, and it doesn't seem apparent to me.
Being out past curfew alone does not make them rioters or destruction of property people, whatever. Like, yeah. With a militia defending, okay. Well, you're saying express purpose of defending property, but my question was, were they actually defending property? Was that their genuine purpose? Contrasting with the Korean stop the shops unapproachable tourists genuinely defending property with their weapons. Here we have a kid getting separated from a militia, running around a riot with a gun on their back. It doesn't look to me like a group of people sitting on the top of... You're trying to like get into people's minds in ways that I can't. If you want to look at the particular situation, we've gone from like... So like all of this here is... deductive. So when I say deductive, when I say that something is deductive, an example of a deductive thing might be all men are mortal, okay, is our first proposition. Socrates is a man, okay, second proposition. If Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. That's our conclusion, okay? When I say something is deductive, that means that by virtue of the logic in the argument, it is true, period, full stop, right? Now, if we're trying to figure out why was Kyle in...
Well, it needs to be valid and sound.
Any given area, we've moved away from the realm of the deductive, and now we've got to go into the inductive, right? So inductive might be, I walk into a room, a person is holding a smoking gun, and another person is laying on the floor shot. Inductively, it seems as though this person has shot the person laying on the ground. I don't know that. That's not 100% true. That's not logically 100% true. That's an inductive argument. So why was Kyle at any given place? Well, when we speak to the intentions of any person, we almost always did inductive. That's not to say that inductive is shit or whatever, but like it seems to be the case that Kyle wasn't there to murder people, and we can inductively argue like, well, why do we believe that? How were his actions? Did his actions seem like he was more as a murderer or as like a protester, anti-protester, whatever? Like we have to go into that, but yeah. The problem here is you're advocating for the unbalanced power structure of the curfew. More or less, it sounds like you're saying people just need to follow the curfew and be controlled, which is the whole point of the protests. Wrong. I reject that. So one, I am saying that people need to be controlled. Nobody disagrees with that. Some level of control is good. We don't want a whole city descending into chaos or mayhem. Number one, okay? Number two, the whole point of the protest is not to break curfew. The point of the protest is to put the police on notice that shit is fucked and to gather support across the country and to raise awareness about, fucked up issues related to police departments. That doesn't require you to riot. You don't need to riot to be a protester. You also don't need to be out past curfew to be a protester. Most bad things with these protests are generally happening past curfew. You can protest just as well in the morning. Don't you think having a bunch of metal folding door to protect their livelihoods could have stopped a lot of looting? Maybe, but I don't know if it should be an obligation of a person. Just because you don't have the particular piece of defensive infrastructure doesn't give another person the right to loot your stuff. Would you extend this justification of self-defense to everywhere internationally, regardless of each country's stance on guns, etc.? I ask this because there are times you mentioned having guns as a God-given right. Glad to be American. No, countries have different amounts of guns. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We have to be very, very careful. I'm sorry, please try to be careful when you contextualize what I say, okay? So right now, I'm having a very fundamental level, philosophical discussion with you. So what I say here is 100% rock solid, this is what I believe fundamentally. When I say you have a God-given right to have a gun in another conversation, I'm talking about with respect to the Second Amendment, with respect to American laws, etc. I don't believe that having a gun is some fundamental right that massively contributes to my internal happiness, that if it's threatened by another person, I can kill them, right? Other countries, I can totally conceive of a world where I live where nobody has guns and we're all totally fine. Yeah. I understand self-defense when it comes to property like housing and businesses, but where is the threshold? What about a stick of gum you own or something? I believe that that could escalate to a lethal situation, but then that's on the aggressor. For instance, let's say that you have a piece of gum, somebody tries to take it from you, like, no, fuck you, you pull the gum back. And they say like, well, fuck you. If you don't give it to me, we're going to fight over it. I'm like, all right, well, fuck it. Let's fight. Let's say that the person pulls out a knife. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to fucking stab you. It's like, okay, we pull out a gun, you kill the person, right? You're not killing them over. Now, the way that people look at this is like, oh, you killed them for a stick of gum. The gum was worth more than their life. No. It's not that the gum was worth more than their life. It's that they made the decision to aggress on me, knowing that their life was on the line for it, and they decided to take that action anyway. And I think that if you put them on notice and you're defending something and they know the consequences, if they attack you, then that's on them. They decided that their life was worth a piece of gum.
Yeah, I think I agree with this sort of point. The idea that if one steals from another person or invades them in some sort of way to do something like petty theft, there's a sense of where there's more to it than just the item that they steal, right? That there's the sort of fundamental violation of other intrinsic values, such as that person being able to have certain types of commodities with them that if they knew that other people were going to steal them, they would never get, right? There's a sort of inhibition or constant inhibiting of oneself that goes around if they were to universally maximize the idea of stealing being permitted. So there are going to be types of codes in which one can't violate if they believe in some sort of universal norm, ethical norm. And that's fine.
That was the choice that they made. You're not responsible for the consequences of their action, even if you're the one doling out the consequences. It's kind of like when a teacher says, I don't give you grades, you earn grades. Just because a teacher fails you on an assignment doesn't mean it's the teacher's fault that you failed. Much the same way that if you're defending property and you've put the other person on notice, I'm going to kill you if you attack me, it's not your fault that they died, even if you were the one that ultimately might have killed them attacking the property. What about a mentally ill person? So depending on the level of mental illness, we would say that the mentally ill person isn't considered a moral agent the same way that a child wouldn't be. And that mentally ill person should be under the possession of another entity, either a family or a government or whatever. And that person doing things is a failing of whoever their caretaker should be. Wait, okay, so I do have an issue with you in principle. Do these rules you have in your form of utilitarianism have exceptions? Like if they, in certain circumstances, cause more harm than they prevent? So in general, I'm not concerned with harm caused to intentionally aggressive parties that understand the harm they might suffer should they do a particular action. I view that as a form of consent, okay? You're strictly talking morally, right? Yeah, this is strictly morally. Like in the real world, I don't think that killing people over gum is like a good way to, I don't think it's a good way to run society. Although maybe, I'm not sure. Destiny, something about this feels off. Like you can conjure
What?
any kind of consequences you want for even minor infractions. Well, like, I mean, like in general, I think that like the consequences for breaking a rule, like if we're talking about like public rules for public safety, I think that's a bit different than aggressing on an individual. So for instance, I don't think that jaywalking could carry a death penalty if the state puts you on notice that they'll kill you if you jaywalk, the same way that aggressing on another individual is the same way. What do you think the long-term ramification of that could be? Someone could then show up with a gun themselves to take that gum, and that could be a worse outcome for you maybe. Well, then you'd call more friends over to do it, I guess. Like the thing is that like the ramifications of my system ultimately end in maybe a civil war if it gets to that level, but then it was always going to get to the level anyway. But the ramifications of the other end are, well, people should just be able to steal and take whatever the fuck they want as long as you can't stop them, since you can't use lethal force. I reject that world. I reject a reality where people can break in, steal shit, fuck with people, or do whatever because you can't kill them as long as they don't threaten you. I reject that moral world. I think that the internal happiness of more people be threatened in that world versus another one where like, hey, if you break in and steal people's shit, they might kill you. Like I think that in that world, I think that we can be respectful enough of each other's properties and each other's persons that we shouldn't be running into that like circumstance too often. Testing morality of guns. Does this scheme require a standing army to protect?
See, I don't follow. I mean, I don't think a lot of some of this is. Yeah, I guess I just don't find a lot of this to be sort of controversial at this point.
The society, external agents, insufficient. Talking about like wars with other.
I mean, of course, you don't want to invade someone's house recklessly, and then steal their possessions and then cause them harm. But I don't think anyone within their right mind who disagrees with, say, private property would agree with that statement either.
Other countries, it's more complicated. I don't want to get into that right now. So morally, you are justified in escalating over the gum, but practically, if the item is important to you, you should drop the interaction. Practically, it sounds stupid to kill somebody over gum for a variety of reasons, but morally, if they're put on notice, if they're like fully like cognizant, they're not like sleepwalking or whatever. I mean, they're making the choice. That's the choice that they're making, right? Here's an example. Let's say that stepping into somebody's backyard, if you know that could kill you, right? Should you do it? Like, okay, well, let's say that you do it and you get killed. Like, if a person kills you, everybody would be outraged. Oh, they just stepped in your backyard. But like, you kind of accept the consequence. Let's say that like a bear lives there instead, right? Well, if you step into the yard and a bear is there, the bear is going to kill you, right? I think that like if you know, like I feel like you consent yourself to that harm. If you know that if you've been put on notice, okay, whether it's a bear roaring at you or an angry old fucking white dude with a rifle pointing at you saying, hey, you cross this area, I'm gonna fucking kill you. Like, you've been put on notice. Like, if you're doing it, to some extent, you're consenting to it. Like, if somebody consents to the consequences you set for them that suggest fucking stupidity on their end, it does not automatically justify the consequences you impose on them. I disagree. I think it 100% automatically justifies the consequences I impose on them. On the flip side, for you, I don't think that somebody being stupid allows them to impose themselves and aggress on your individual rights. That would be the flip side of what you're saying. Well, if somebody's dumb enough, they should be able to aggress on you without consequence. I disagree with that. I reject that. How to treat the internal happiness of amoral agents.
Yeah. And this is where I think we need to get into subjects that I'm not familiar with, but a lot of what he says seems sort of, I'm sort of suspicious of, because it's probably underread in the philosophy of law. And I'm not sure if whatever arbitrary consequence that a person has or makes up is going to be justified if a person enters into someone's house. I mean, I'd have to look into it, but if a person's surrendering and they have their hands up, I think in certain states they might not be able to be shot anymore. I don't know if that's in every state, though, and I'm definitely going to have to look that up. But the idea that even if it is justified by law right now doesn't mean that it's justified in period. It seems as though there are going to be certain types of egregious consequences that one could get led into because of things that people do, like, say, break into people's backyards. So we need to ask ourselves not just the legality of it, but the morality of it as well. But this is, I don't think this is a fairly trivial point, but a lot of these points right now have been fairly trivial.
Such as children, mentally impaired animals. I view people that are non-agents as basically property. Like, I would view them as an extension of some other ownership model. So, for instance, I don't consider the morality of a 5 or 6 year old child. I would consider them to be an extension of their owners, which would be their parents. Or like an extremely mentally ill person, I wouldn't be like morally considering them. I'd be thinking of them as extensions of their caretakers or their family. Destiny, I would assume you agree morally with owning some sort of home defense option that kills an illegal entrance onto a property even if no one is home, as long as the person is adequately put on notice, and it's reasonable to assume that they're put on notice, then I think that that's okay. I don't think that most people would violate the property at that point. So, like, there's one really fucked up thing that people do that I don't feel is fair enough in terms of putting on notice. I think some people in, I wish I had an example of a story. I know I've read a story about this, but there was a guy, I think, that put like zip lines or razor lines or something up at like head level in forests so that if anybody like drove through their forest, they would be decapitated. Wires on ATV trails, yeah. I don't think that that's properly putting somebody on notice. It's totally possible that somebody could drive through, not see a sign. It's totally possible that somebody like just doesn't know about that and then they get killed. I don't think that they consented to that level of potential harm or that risk by doing that.
There's actually a lot of these sorts of incidences that I think are really interesting in the philosophy of law. I only know a handful of them because I talked to one of my friends who's doing law right now. And the question of sort of signs and what you could be legally responsible for and what you can be legally accountable for in certain types of scenarios is very ambiguous and fuzzy. So there's actually scenarios of, say, and this is one of the examples straight from one of my friends. Say that in, say, a skiing resort, one would assume that you shouldn't go to a ski resort, obviously, if the snow is not there. But there are a number of people that do what? They get a bike, they go to the ski resort, and they ride down the mountain, basically, of where they should be skiing normally, except without snow. And there are all sorts of hazards that exist due to the lack of snow, like rocks, right? That they generally collide in, and they break their bones, and then what happens? They sue the company, and they succeed. Now, why do they succeed? Obviously, they're out there, perhaps even illegally, biking down the mountain while they shouldn't be. It's because they're hasn't been an adequate amount of resources that that company provided that would have been able to make a rational choice to not ski down the mountain, actually, so it turns out. That there needs to be enough indicators, either via signs or some other way, to the person so they cannot be, so they're liably accountable for their own type of suffering. Because in a lot of these scenarios, especially if you're rich enough and have a lot of good lawyers, is that you can get the other person, or so the other party, liably responsible for these for these types of events. And I think there's all sorts of these sorts of legal issues that turn up, of where certain types of private organizations, we'll just say organizations or businesses or whatever, don't give enough information to their product and don't give enough information about the sort of environment that they've laid out, that people can go skiing, boating, or whatever, to where a person can consciously make a rational decision for what they ought to do. And so they can be held legally responsible for our own fuck-ups.
Put on notice is one thing. The issue seems to be that they should be able to explain their notice, such as access required for their livelihood or sentimental, and not just simply because they put out a notice. This is absurd to the point of being relentless. It needs to be a reasonable limit to defense of property. I disagree. Totally disagree. I don't believe that it's moral. So I'll flip this around on you then. So in NXT, so I'm going to flip the question around on you. Do you think that as long as some piece of property, let's say that as long as some, so here's my problem. Ready? Okay, two premises. Okay, here we go. Let's say that I am sufficiently strong enough that I could kill anybody in hand-to-hand combat. One. And two, let's say that I can identify a piece of property that is yours that isn't like necessary to your livelihood or well-being. Okay? Does that mean that I should be able to freely destroy any of that property that I want? Because that seems to be the logical extension of your system. If the only way to stop me is to kill me, and I can identify some piece of property of yours that I can destroy that's not essential to your well-being or livelihood, should I be able to just do that over and over and over again? Destiny, do you really think of taxation as theft? Isn't it just the cost of service you receive from the nation? Well, no. I mean, more wealthy people probably pay a greater percentage than they get back. I mean, whether or not it's theft is a bit tautological. Some people consider theft the unjust taking of something. So by definition, theft is already bad. But I mean, theft in terms of just like taking something from you. I mean, like taxation is theft in that way. But I mean, I consider it like a moral form of theft. But some people would say that theft is always immoral, kind of like a moral murder. People would call it not murder, but killing. So people wouldn't say it's theft. It's more like an exchange of service, right? Yeah.
These are just semantical disputes.
Confused as to what the good is and what is utilitarianism. So the good is an individual's happiness, is what the good is, basically. And then the rule utilitarianism point of view I put is like, what type of like rules can we put out to ensure that we're reciprocating values amongst everybody that guarantees the internal happiness of as many people as possible? Destiny, if you are talking in a moral vacuum for the gum scenario and there's only the binary, it takes my gum or I kill them, then I agree, but this is so abstracted from reality. Okay, you have to stop this, okay? If I ask an engineer, okay, an architectural engineer is very fucking rarely going to have to deal with like 3 + 9. Probably ever. Never. Actually, never, because math doesn't exist in the real world. I'm a mathematical anti-realist, okay? If you were to ask an architectural engineer...
That's a funny story right there.
Hey, what's 3 + 9? And they were to say...
I'm actually a mathematical Platonist, by the way, guys. I haven't got into that, but yes.
What? Do you mean to ask me what are 3 I-beams by 9 I-beams, or what is like a 2x4 piece of
you should have a debate about mathematical Platonism.
wood, or what is like a 3 + 9? What an absurd hypothetical. I've never seen 3 + 9 in all my days of architecture. What a stupid and foolish question. If you can't answer an abstracted, simplistic, absurd hypothetical, that means that you don't have this foundation. You have no moral principles to stand on, and instead you're appealing to some vague form of intuition to try to generate you moral answers, and you can't have the conversation. You absolutely, if I ask you a thing in a vacuum, you should be able to give me a yes or no answer. Now, if that yes or no answer disagrees with the practical application, then you should be able to explain why as well. LOL Destiny, you just talked through the example of whether or not killing someone over gum was morally justified. Do you understand what I just said? Does he not understand what I just said? Do most of you understand what I just said? Do most of you understand why this guy's comment is really fucking stupid? Or Destiny, booby traps are not considered self-defense because they're proactive and not reactive. It has nothing to do with giving someone sufficient notice. You have to react to imminent danger from a neutral state. In other words, you must be the agent that responds into the danger. It cannot be automatic. That's why you're not culpable. You're talking about legal shit. I don't give a fuck. I don't care. I don't know why I just wasted my time reading that argument. I think murder should be in the societal contract to be in the hands of the police/professional problem solver as a last resort in problem cases and not the... Okay. So what all of you have to answer, and you could bite the bullet on this because we might have a fundamental disagreement here, is what you have to say is, if certain people are trying to destroy your property and the only way you can to defend yourself is through lethal means, do you always have to just back off and let them destroy whatever they want? I don't think that I should have to compel another person to do that. Okay? If a woman has spent 20 years building her perfect garden and she has it and she loves it and that's what she spent her life doing or whatever, and some guy is walking up with a Molotov cocktail saying, "I'm gonna burn all of your shit to the fucking ground," and the woman can very easily run away and be safe. The woman can very easily back off, and the guy's not gonna kill her. He just wants to destroy her fucking shit or whatever. I don't think that I have a right to compel the woman to abandon her stuff and say, "Oh, sorry, you gotta let him kill his shit."
I mean, unfortunately, I kind of agree with him on some issues right here, at least regarding residential houses, because I'm not really sure. This is not because I hold any sort of firm position on it. I'm not really sure if public households, cul-de-sac areas generally should be destroyed within the protest riots, because I don't think that they have the sort of directed intention that is oriented in a way that follows or tracks what is good. It's not to say that I'm not against or for the destruction of certain types of forms of public property, say a police building or whatever, or big businesses or something like that. But there's obviously a lot of reasons why we wouldn't want to destroy someone's private house for the things that are going on right now. That doesn't mean that there aren't any examples whatsoever where it would be justified, just not in certain scenarios that I've looked into lately.
I don't think so. I think that she has a right to say, "Listen to me. I'm putting you on notice. If you're going to continue to advance and you're going to try to destroy my shit, I'm going to kill you." Now the ball is in your park, okay? You can make the choice on whether or not you want to accept that consequence, but now the choice is yours. I've told you what's going to happen if you do it. I think the woman has every right to defend her property in that case. I don't think that she has to be compelled. I don't think she has to be compelled to abandon her stuff against a would-be attacker. I feel that it's really hard to overcome the absurdity of situations so frustrating. Sure. That's an example of us continually adding things to the pile of items destroyed. At a certain point, that pile of near worthless items becomes worth something correct. Also, the time required to defend items of little worth. I agree that you should be able to defend items of value. I'm just wondering what the lower limit reasonably is. I don't know. If I go to the extreme hypothetical that I'm given, I don't know if I think there needs to be a lower limit. I think that if you've sufficiently put somebody on notice and you've exhausted all other means to get them to back off and they continue to push, then I think that you have a right to defend it with lethal force every time. As someone asks, if you don't consider children moral agents of your world, could killing them with the consent of both parents be moral? If you don't consider children moral agents in your world, could killing them with the consent of both parents be moral? Ooh, that's a really interesting question. Intuitively, the answer is no. Why is the answer no? I've always joked.
It's actually a really good question. I did not think of that question. But I mean, it was a really bad statement to take into, your belief system. The idea that babies are just sort of ownership of people, because you are going to open up yourself to the line of attack that literally you can kill that child until they're 17 and then not at 18, and then there's some sort of arbitrary distinction between 17 and 18 that allows you to kill at any point because it's a byproduct of your property. And where else does this remind us of shit? Oh, it reminds us of slaves being also an extension of our property.
The thing is there's an old Peter Singer argument for abortion that allows you to abort your kids up to like 3 or 4 years old, I think. Just because you don't have moral... Okay, I think this is a disconnect. Just because you don't have moral agency doesn't mean you don't have moral consideration. I think that those are two fundamentally separate properties. So I think that a child can have no moral agency, but I think that they still must be endowed with some level of moral consideration, would be the response to that. Why?
If they are, though, given moral consideration, then you're going to have to say that in some sense this is a human being that is autonomous, that we can't just use in the way that we use property. How do we use property as a means to an end? How do we use human beings as an end in themselves? So what he's doing is basically relegating the baby now, the child, to the latter camp as someone, as a being that has ends in themselves. Now, of course, not in the same way that adults do, but nonetheless, without all of the moral particularities and all the epistemic particularities of being able to be fully consistent, they do have certain types of ends which they follow. That is, even human beings that are children have certain types of traits of which suggest goal-oriented behavior.
Why are they? This is a deeply unsatisfying answer. But the reason why they are is because they're humans, and that's it. That's the only answer. There is no reason why. I don't think that morality is a real thing. I don't think there's a good way to answer it.
It's not a very good answer.
But I would build that answer into my internal happiness model, and in terms of like reciprocated value.
No, you wouldn't, because you wouldn't do. If there are certain types of sacrifices that he'd have to willingly make for his child, he'd probably willingly make those sacrifices even if they conflicted with his internal state of happiness, unless he arbitrarily selects to say that the full form of internal happiness now somehow shifts into the survival of this human being.
That, like, in order for society to function, children need to be able to grow up and be happy and healthy, and that if we had a society where people were just allowed to kill children on a whim, that society would probably
this stream will be saved. They're all saved. They're all under my YouTube channel.
Be pretty fucked. Extend that to animals then. Or what about a hypothetical proto-human thing from hypothetical proto-human things get interesting. Animals I don't really care about, because animals don't represent any threat to internal happiness ever. It's a pretty cold or fucked up answer, but I think it's the only good one. So not morally responsible, but still the subject of morality. Yeah. Destiny, why are so many leftists opposed to any form of civilized militia? Based off your reasoning, wouldn't it generally be positive respect to protecting people's internal happiness? Do you consider yourself an ally? I don't know. I don't know much about militias. If they're reformed responsibly, then sure. You could also go to the real point of view. We cannot exist in a world we could have been executed as children if we were out to not execute children. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I think that children still have like internal happiness that needs to be respected, right? And children can also contribute to the internal happiness of other people. Do we consider capacity to gain moral sentience is considered moral worth? No, we don't go by future. We don't evaluate a current person based on future probabilities. If that was the case, then we would be like pro-life. We would have to be anti-abortion. But I don't think that we can make current decisions now, like weighing like I don't think that we can consider like a non-existent life. I don't think that non-existent life has moral consideration. If that makes sense. Do you think a person can sanely forfeit their moral consideration by taking the gum? No, I mean they could do it for a few reasons. Maybe they think they won't suffer punishment. Maybe, I don't know. They could do it for a few reasons. Do you have a different take on moral, intelligent animals? No, I don't care. I don't care about any animals. It just has to be by humans. Yeah. So you admit that this is just a personal thing made up and morality doesn't exist? Yes, Edgelord 66666. I already said that. Yeah. Destiny, this doesn't mesh with your other beliefs, and you were somehow going over quickly. The reason you value other people is because they can uphold the social contract. Children cannot do so. Children should only be given rights insofar as it benefits other adults. Yeah, but I mean, I think that's generally what we do, right? Like, children are only given rights. Like, we violate the rights of children all the time, right? So, for instance, we force them to go to school. We force them to go to bed. We force them to eat food that they might not want to eat. But we generally do all of these things for, like, the well-being.
That's only if you define rights in the negative sense. So it would be a violation of negative rights, but not of positive rights. And I'm sure you guys have heard, if you watch any other philosophy YouTube videos, the distinction between positive and negative rights, right? So negative rights just being freedom of speech, freedom to basically say what you want, freedom to a gun or whatever. Well, maybe not a gun. But positive rights might be certain types of things like healthcare organizations, schools, things that offer us an avenue of fulfilling certain types of ends, like education, by inhibiting us in certain types of other ways. So, I mean, any form of like codified law can be a form of positive right as well, right? Only by inhibiting ourselves and inhibiting others to certain types of degrees do we get the possibility of all these unique types of items. So when we talk about children and we put them to school and we basically tell them what to eat, right? All these types of things, they're not necessarily in a violation of rights. It's good for the child. It actually offers them a greater series of potentialities, I think, in the future.
Of the child, right? Typically, anything that we force a child to do against its will, we're ultimately doing it for their own well-being, under the assumption that these guys aren't capable moral agents that can make these decisions on their own, right? And then once they're 18, then they are capable of making this on their own. I agree. I would just for edge case scenarios, killing
to some extent, and then we have other types of laws because people are still inconsistent and aren't able to follow the types of ethical norms or laws that are codified within society. So, I mean, there's really no distinction there, if you notice, between, at least in that one point, between a child and a human being, because they both have the capacity of error. Unless you're willing to say that children under the age of 18 aren't capable of moral judgments in any sort of way.
Children could be a net good, i.e. euthanizing excess kids due to population pressures or perhaps extreme illness or mental problems. Yeah, it's possible. It could be, sure. That gets into some very uncomfortable eugenics conversations. However, I will say, I think that a lot of pro-choice people unintentionally make eugenics arguments anyways. So for instance, when pro-choice people say, like, listen, it might be a life, but I think you should be able to abort in cases of, like, incest or in cases where the fetus is, like, severely mentally disabled, that's a eugenics argument. Can you explain the hypothetical of a business dying due to another business versus a group of people destroying it? People in the panel were saying those are the same thing. So in society, we have the ability to compete with other people based on our economic organization, right? Currently our system is organized under a system of capitalism. Whoever can deliver the cheapest goods and services at the highest qualities to people are
Thank you
hopefully
for
the ones that
following,
survive
my
in the
man.
market. If somebody moves in and they outcompete you, that's part of the contract that we have with each other. Okay, fine. Like that happens, right? Much the same way that if I have a crush on a girl and I really like her and a better guy comes along for her and she dates him, I can't kill that guy because he took my girl and decreased my happiness. The same way that if somebody outcompeted a business, I can't just kill them because they like outcompeted my business. Like that's not how that works. You wouldn't be justified in doing that. Now, if somebody showed up and like set your business on fire or stole money from you or whatever, like yeah. Destiny, ignoring future happiness seems to have some problems. Climate change may not be perfect, but do you think that extinction level events 200 years from now, which causes that originate particularly from now, have no more relevance? Yeah, I don't think so. That sucks, but I don't see a good argument for it. Intuitively, that feels really bad for me to say, but like, yeah, it seems hard. Thankfully, intuitively, I kind of get around this by saying that like, well, climate change impacts we are feeling now and in our lifetime, so we ought to do something about it. But I have like a really hard time. If I go back to like the 1700s or the 1800s and people were starting to invent things like light bulbs or whatever, or we started to get like the early inventions of medicine, and I say, hey, stop industrializing. You're gonna hurt the earth 400 years from now. Your lives need to keep sucking, and you need to keep dying from disease. I don't know like what moral compulsion that person would feel. Like fuck. Well, bad things might happen to people in the future that I'm never gonna see, never gonna meet 400 years from now. They might not even exist. They might all kill themselves before then. I guess I should make sacrifice now. I don't know how you could morally compel somebody to do that. So if I could put a bomb underground that will explode 200 years and blow the earth, I mean, if there's a serious benefit to putting that bomb underground, maybe I don't know. I think it'd be morally wrong for me to place a nuke underground. Well, like the thing about placing a nuke underground is like, well, fuck, does it benefit you now? Like if it just doesn't, if it's just fucking shit out, that just seems like kind of shitty. That doesn't seem to be good at all, right? What would be your argument against eugenics? You seem to reject it outright. I don't argue against eugenics at all. I think that there are some totally valid forms of like eugenic arguments. But the only problem that I have with eugenics it's not the problem with eugenics. It's a problem with telling other people what they can or cannot do reproductively. That's generally my issue with eugenics. But I mean, like, I think some form of eugenics is like perfectly fine. Say for instance, is Parkinson's the like ultra like genetically heritable disease? If there are like certain diseases like these like genetic diseases that like are super highly transmissible or whatever, if we could,
you know. It's been a while, so I can't comment too much on this, but there was an article on the New Atlantis about eugenics. Well, it was about gene editing that I recommend everyone here read, and basically the types of problems that are going to occur once we're able to edit the human genome. So if you go on, I think it might be this article, but it's been a while. If you go on New Atlantis, there's a pretty good article about the sort of problems that is going to occur. I'm going to have to reread this, and I might do it in another stream. But one thing that I can say is this, that the scientific movement, maybe to phrase it in a better way, is, or any type of technology or types of sciences that we are developing right now are moving in a sort of accelerated manner in one sense. And that sense is that generally we tend to think, hold on, I'm trying to fix the stream. I don't know why it did this. Yeah, I don't know why it... There we go. Yeah, I got huge all of a sudden. Well, that's probably because I fucked with it. So there's a sense of where technology and science kind of outperforms human wisdom, or the types of inferences that we make in ethics. That is to say that before we begin talking about whether we ought to do certain types of things like gene editing is already going to exist. We're never going to have a certain type of discourse about whether or not we should have this new type of technology. Mainly, this type of new technology is already good, because anything that science can do is good. We need to be wary of the types of implications that we get into when we concede to technology such as that. There's ways of which, even in the mundane sense, of where technology has sort of autonomy over us. That is, it supplants certain types of tendencies whether they be minute or strong. And we are obviously very knowledgeable about big ones like Facebook, tackling certain types of dopamine receptors in order for us to, I don't know, buy more shit or go to certain types of websites. And then, just the sheer power of certain types of social media outlets and the addiction that it can sort of create and the habits that it can sort of form. Video games do this too, right? Being compelled on the computer, as much as you guys love being here, it is, in some sense, if it goes on too long, a form of a bad addiction. And these are big ones, right? But then there's smaller ones that I think that we need to keep in mind as well. And the smaller ones aren't inherently bad in every single way. And I'm not criticizing technology as being all bad, but take, for example, a small mundane thing like roads, right? Or pathways. Roads have, as with any type of technology, a sort of means-ends relationship. That means that any type of technology or artifact that we create has an intended purpose for its creation, such that it has an end in mind, and the tool itself is the means of which it gets to that end. And roads have really one purpose, right? To get us to certain types of destinations in an efficient manner, in a way that hasn't been done previously, say by highway systems. And really complicated highway systems are really good at getting us to places within work. So when you have this type of technology, well, the first thing you'd think of, well, the efficiency of roads. Great, I can get to anywhere that I want as fast as I can. But one doesn't begin to sort of think about the unintended consequences of the artifact. Because the unintended consequence of the artifact isn't what's intentionally built into the content that gives it purpose towards a directed type of end. But nonetheless, here are some consequences of having a road, right? Now that I can live a certain amount of distance away and I can get to any place within the general facility, let's say my general country or state, I can now live further away from my family members. So we'll no longer live in a commune. We'll no longer be in a residential area of where I'm with friends and family. I'll be away from them. And this sort of disperses the idea of a family unit to some extent. It makes it sort of harder for them to keep in contact. And one begins to sort of accept this as a norm, as a sort of tendency of a hyperly industrialized society. Then we have something like planes, which can even increase the distance further. I can be in another country altogether away from my family. And these are just small little mundane ways, right, of which we generally don't think of the types of consequences that occur from these. Or we can talk about slightly bigger ones, like the ones that Karl Marx thought of with the concept of alienation. And the concept of alienation means something sort of like this, and I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but this kind of plays into the technology. Let's say that if we have a factory, right? Now, prior to the factory, there's a sense of where the artisan or the employee could craft his own items and then put in some sort of effort into it, and he would see the item, and he would sell the item. And as far as the item went, whether it be a widget or a bow tie or whatever, he could see who it's going to generally, and they would know who it's created by. And then there's a sense of actually being attached to one's work as an artisan, or as a craftsman, I guess, in this sense. Since I think that there's a small, but I think there's actually a substantial difference between an artisan and a craftsman, but I won't get into that right now because I don't want to get into the philosophy of aesthetics. So there's a way of that person becoming detached from the commodity that they're creating, right? When you install such a thing as a factory. What happens when you have a factory is that you become a sort of extension of the factory themselves as that individual who participates in it. An extension that seems now but an additive entity that could be replaced, one of which is a part of the machine, a sort of a cog in the machine kind of metaphor, and one of which can easily get fired. The employee is just there, doesn't really have communication with their boss, doesn't really participate in the business in any sort of significant way. They become alienated from their work. they've become nothing more than a worker or an employee that is putting in a certain amount of hours that then gets exploited by those hours, by the generation of surplus value, of which goes to the employer. And so in this way, even though we can efficiently create more widgets than we ever could before with a factory, there's a sense of where increasing forms of alienation occur due to the factory worker, increasing forms of alienation that occur, let's say, that we're distant from our family unit because of roads and airplanes. The fact that we're addicted to technology as much as we ever are at this point because of certain types of scientific engagements. And furthermore, these things sort of compound upon themselves until one can see sort of a wheel spinning out of control of habits and dispositions that people have because of technological interfaces that exist in a society. Ones that sort of continuously manipulate what we do and how we act. And so the technological device no longer becomes a means for our end, but instead becomes a way of which we're relegated and in which we function on a daily basis because it's set up in this and this and this way. Whereas nature has this sort of spontaneous order of not in advance, and this is, I think, like a kind of Star Trek theme, not in advance having something in which it does, but being able to spontaneously adapt through different types of mechanisms that weren't pre-codified or weren't pre-generated, right? When we have an artifact, with the exception of a few artifacts, the rules are set in advance, and we follow those sets of rules. A road is going to do what it does until some destruction happens. A computer is going to do what it does, unless it's an artificial form of intelligence which can make a series of adaptations. So I just find this sort of interesting that when we get into gene development or medicine, there's also going to be a certain type of things that are going to manipulate how we are. So if we can gene edit ourselves and make ourselves black, white, Mexican, have a certain type of intelligence, have a certain type of humor, human beings become a commodity. They become a certain type of being of which eventually norms will be created in order for them to act in accordance with those types of norms. And they need to basically have whatever trajectory is set up in a society. One can imagine, and this is beginning to get into a speculative thesis of mine, that there are certain types of proclivities that we need to get done in society, certain types of tendencies, and therefore we're going to develop human beings that fulfill those certain types of ends, and in which it would be possible to create a human species that is intended for a certain type of purpose that was already pre-written. And that, to me, seems basically like the most disgusting thing possible, right? When you remove a sort of element of human spontaneity and freedom and the ability of randomness to be generated. I think this is actually in a Star Trek episode, but hopefully I'm not going too far off course here.
Could eradicate these diseases by like doing like egg implants or like sperm donations or whatever. Like I think that would be like a positive form of eugenics, avoiding those types of things. I think that would be like okay. Eugenics for like people that like look a certain way, that gets a little bit weird. I don't think that's a good thing, but oh yeah, Huntington's disease, sure. Do you believe in objective morality? Of course not. The DDoS kid was a Twitch streamer. Can you not kill him since he's depriving you of your income as part of a competitive market? DDoSing somebody is not part of a competitive market. Much the same that going to somebody's store and burning it down is not part of a competitive market. You're like destroying somebody's business, like through an aggressive action to just like destroy or disuse their property or whatever, right? Assuming it was a legal action? No, it was a legal action, then that's fine. If that's like part of the game, if people are like, oh, like DDoSing, whatever, that's like part of like the competition of streaming, then sure, that's fine. But that's because everybody in that has made that agreement, right? That's part of that contract that everybody has with each other. All right, I got like 2 more of these. I'm fucking tired, okay? Destiny, if attacking, retreating people isn't self-defense, since you have other options with a threat, was countering the idea that attacking assertives can be self-defense, since you also the option, other options where attacking assertives don't actually mitigate through being, for example. Oh, yeah, sure. Like, I don't think that attacking all conservatives is necessarily 100% immediately morally justifiable. This would be like a last resort type thing if all voting and all other measures have failed or whatever, sure. Is there any legal action a business can take to destroy your income which warrants a violent response? The thing is that legality should codify our laws. The law should be a codification of our morals. And if we're all operating under the same laws, then we should generally accept those business practices as being competitive. And like, just because somebody outcompetes us doesn't mean that we should, whatever, be like, we have to go kill them. However, the law is downstream from morality, meaning codify. just because something is legal, a law, doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. So it is possible that a business could engage in such an unbelievably aggressive action, even though it is the law, you reject it, you disagree with it, you think that law exists in some way, and then you could start taking escalating measures that could end with violence. So for instance, however, killing an individual would rarely be the solution. But like, for instance, let's say that it's legal to dump waste in a lake that like is destroying a town. Well, fuck, you could picket the business. Maybe that doesn't work. You can start protesting the business. You could boycott them. Maybe that doesn't work. You can start destroying the roads that lead to the business. If their pollution of your water is literally destroying your village, then you could burn down their factory. You could start you could escalate to violent measures to make them stop. You know, like if they're getting workers to show up and like fight the fires and blah blah, blah, you could attack the workers if it comes down to that. Yeah, for sure. In that sense, you could escalate. Yeah.
See, he seems to be in kind of an antithetical position to what he was saying earlier. He seems to have exceptions to the rule of where all of the social contracts that he came up with earlier that were codified via morality are now uplifted, right? Why are they uplifted? Because morality, which preceded any of these types of things, which preceded the social contract, which preceded private property, which preceded and grounded everything else, showed us, miraculously, almost the particular situation showed us that we can, in this scenario, in this factory scenario, rebel against the workers and cause violence. Hey, but what about all those arguments of where those are workers that have a job, that have a life, that have, you know, a family, that have houses? All of these sorts of conservative concerns, generally with the riots, generally with all the types of problem scenarios that we're facing right now, could yet again be pulled up. But in this scenario, he's okay with it. In other scenarios, he's not. And so there has to be a sort of story, a narrative in which you give of where these have some sort of asymmetric moral culpabilities, right? And that story hasn't yet to be generated.
But it's impossible for the government to take a law that takes into account everyone's individual morality. Well, that's the goal of the government. It should. Most laws should take into account like almost everybody's like individual preferences. They should, yeah. If Kyle Rittenhouse threatened to kill the dude before the dude started chasing him, he would be the aggressor, not in the wrong right. Yeah, but the thing is, once Kyle started running, I think he would have like dropped that. That would have been a de-escalation, and then killing him past that point, I don't think is okay. Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to sleep. Okay. Destiny, don't plenty of laws exist that should exist that don't necessarily codify morality? For example, we can say that we should have laws for speed limits and that running speed limits as an individual is not necessarily immoral. If we believe that the law is a reflection of morality, then we would argue that it would be immoral. So for instance, if speed limits exist because they represent a desire to keep roads safe, and we acknowledge that going...
Yes, we would, but obviously they don't, right? If the state, if our legislation system is a system that's based on illegitimate violence, then resistance can come in to legitimate it through violence.
Going past a certain speed limit creates an unsafe or hazardous condition that can create the conditions that increase the risk towards other people's well-being, then in that case, speeding would be immoral. Sure. We can do more of these later. I hope that like something that I hope to demonstrate in answering these questions, I hope something that you maybe see, or maybe you don't, maybe it's all voodoo magic or whatever. Even if maybe you disagree with some of my underlying premises, like I would hope that like when you ask me a question and I'm able to talk through it and answer it fairly quickly, that it becomes obvious that like even if you disagree with some of these underlying foundations, by having this underlying foundation, you can ask me like a relatively difficult question, but I can talk through it like pretty quickly because I just have to appeal to like my my fundamental principles here. Like, oh, well, what if this thing were to happen? It would be crazy. Like, okay, that would be crazy. Well, let's think.
It's almost as if everything that he does in virtue of practical ethics supervenes on what happens in normative ethics, which supervenes on meta-ethics. It's almost as if this line that he's doing, this foundational line that he's doing, seems to be built into his system, which somehow, for some reason, right here, where he talks about meta-ethics being dumb, is now coming out of the woodworks and reinstilling himself in the very end
right
of his lecture.
We aggressing to somebody's happiness? Like, if we are, like, can this person take reasonable steps to stop it? Like, if they can, like, are they doing so? Like, or like, if you're aggressing on somebody's happiness, is that a reasonable aggression? Like, there are questions we can ask. We can very quickly get down to like, what is the answer? Like, yes or no. As long as we have these like initial fundamental positions figured out. There might be some like really weird, tricky questions, like, what if we create an AI that turns into a human being that is sufficiently intelligent? Like, that might get like a little bit strange. Because unfortunately, I have to bake in an arbitrary assumption here that the only individual happiness that matters is humans. That's just a thing. Some people here will do sentient life, in which case you would use this exact same moral system to be vegan. But yeah, it's called the U.S. flag. You stupid fuck. This is the only flag that the United States federally hasn't recognized.
Okay, guys. So there it is. We have finished our critique of Destiny.